Good day, all, and greetings from Abuja. My name is James Barnett, and I'm a research fellow with Hudson Institute, specializing in African conflict and security studies. Today, it's my pleasure to moderate this virtual discussion on the future of U.S.-Nigeria relations in the midst of what has been an eventful few months in bilateral ties. In late October last year, President Trump declared Nigeria a country of particular concern over religious freedom violations, specifically claiming that Christians were being singled out for violence by Islamist groups in the country. He upped the ante just a couple of days later when he threatened that the U.S. would go into Nigeria, quote, guns a-blazing, if the Nigerian government did not put an end to the violence. Then on Christmas Day, a U.S. destroyer fired a barrage of Tomahawk missiles at suspected Islamic State-linked militants in northwestern Nigeria. The Nigerian government, while disagreeing with President Trump's characterization of the violence in Nigeria as a religious crisis, has publicly welcomed the U.S. airstrikes and said it sees an opportunity to strengthen security cooperation with Washington. Just this past week, U.S. troops began arriving in Nigeria as part of what the U.S. and Nigerian governments describe as a non-combat training and support mission to bolster the Nigerian counterinsurgency efforts in the country. I've been privileged to have lived and worked in Nigeria for a number of years now, and I've shared plenty of my own commentary on U.S.-Nigeria relations in recent months, but I still have a lot of questions about where things go next, what the U.S. and Nigerian governments ultimately hope to achieve through this new relationship, and at the end of the day, what impacts it will have for ordinary Nigerians who are suffering from this violence in the country. So to that end, I've assembled a panel of colleagues today whose insights I've always enjoyed hearing. They'll be walking us through the different aspects of U.S.-Nigeria relations, including the diplomatic, security, and political angles to this relationship. Please allow me to briefly introduce them, and then we'll get this conversation started. Joining us from Abuja, Dr. Kabir Adamu is a recognized security thought leader and managing director of Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited. Joining us from Lagos, Cheta Nwanze is CEO of SBM Intelligence and a widely read columnist in both Nigerian and UK media. Also in Abuja, Yusuf Anka is a humanitarian and security specialist and former journalist. He won multiple awards for his 2022 BBC documentary on the conflict in northwestern Nigeria, titled The Bandit Warlords of Zamfara, which I highly recommend to all who haven't seen it. And then joining us from Washington, Michael Walsh is an affiliated faculty at the University of Alaska Anchorage and a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. All views that he expresses today are his own. Now, to get us started, I'd like to turn to Cheta, please, to kick us off. And my question here is in two parts. First, I want you to take us through the Nigerian reaction to the Trump administration's moves in recent months. Is it fair to say that the administration of President Tinubu was initially caught off guard by the CPC designation and Trump's discussion of U.S. military intervention, but that they've found their footing since? Or is this still kind of an unstable relationship in that regard? And then secondly, kind of linked to that question, how would you characterize the popular reactions within Nigeria to this diplomatic episode? And I intentionally use the term reactions there because, as we know, Nigeria is a big country, very diverse country, is not politically or religiously homogenous for that matter. And so I don't want to presume that there's been any single reaction. So Cheta, if you could please get us started.
Okay, thank you so much, and thanks for getting me here. I like the fact that you consistently use country in describing Nigeria, because that's what is something that we're very careful to do within SBM Intelligence. We avoid describing Nigeria as a nation. Nigeria could become a nation at some point, but it's not yet there. We're a country of different nations who have their different interests. And this showed in, for example, the reaction to the coup in Niger Republic a couple of years ago, when the reaction from the southwest part of Nigeria was very different to the reaction from the northern part of Nigeria when the Nigerian government threatened to invade Nigeria. So basically, I'm already answering your second question first. Basically, there are different reactions to what has happened. And I think it's important to point out that there is not a Christian genocide in Nigeria. There are acts of genocide. Genocide has a very high bar to prove. You need to prove intent as well as acts. I would say that there are acts of genocide going on in Nigeria, and it's important to stress not just the Christian community in northern Nigeria, but Muslims in northern Nigeria, Igbos in southeastern Nigeria, people in the middle belt of Nigeria, which is where Christianity and Islam basically collide. The Nigerian government has lost control of internal security. This is something that can't be denied. So, in many respects, the Tinubu government was caught off guard when President Trump designated Nigeria as a country for particular concern. It was, for me, it was a case of bad diplomacy. The US had telegraphed this for a very long time, but Nigeria basically, unfortunately we built a system where we are set up to be to be reactive, not proactive, and that's shows very true. But having said that, I think that the actions, things that have happened since then, has been a study in strategic evolution. While the initial response was very disorganized, you had various presidential aides trading social media insults. You had critics accusing the government of denial. The pivot, eventually, when it came, was very quick and very decisive. And I would say that the turning point was the Christmas Day airstrikes. When those happened, they essentially presented the government with two bad options. A, basically shout at the Americans for impugning Nigeria's sovereignty and and basically keep a lot of people in northern Nigeria happy, or concede to the Americans and then basically keep a lot of people in northern Nigeria unhappy. What the government chose to do was concede to the Americans. I think that it was the better choice of two really bad choices, because if you look at the current political climate on the planet, who can hurt the presidency of Nigeria more at the moment? It's Donald Trump. So claiming, in my view, and I think that both Yusuf and Dr. Kabir would probably back me up on this. I don't believe for 1 second that the Americans informed Nigeria before conducting the airstrikes. They did it themselves. But eventually, they gave room for Nigeria to sort of save face. So effectively, sovereignty was preserved while some immediate threats were removed. There has been, from our monitoring of the situation, there has been some upticks in attacks, but things seem to have reached a sort of equilibrium that may or may not deliver results. What I'm basically saying is that we have reached a tactical, there's been a tactical win. Whether there will be a strategic win is something that we will see in the long term. But I mean, the diplomatic machinery has been delivering some results. On paper, intelligence sharing has deepened. I think within the context of AGOA, the AGOA extension that has happened, and there have been some arrests for terrorism financing, and it has allowed the president to push through some of the things that he wanted to do. So, for example, deployment of forest guards, and then some constitutional amendments advancing the powers of state police. But going back to the second question, domestic support will remain fractured. There will be, again, that's basic truth of Nigeria not being a nation, but a country. Some people will support, some people will oppose. My main worry is that a lot of that support or opposition is along sectarian lines, which carries the risk of deepening the problems that we already have. And God knows, and everyone on this call knows, that we have a lot of problems.
Thank you, Cheta, for that helpful introduction. I think now is a good time to pivot to Dr. Kabir. Doctor, I'd like you to offer you a chance to kind of respond to some of the points Cheta made. And my question is actually kind of very similar to something I think you started to discuss, which is almost a question of narratives, right? President Trump has framed Nigeria's security crisis in religious terms, talking about violence against Christians in particular. You know, many researchers and analysts say, of course, that it's more complicated than that. But saying simply, well, it's more complicated, it's not really in and of itself kind of a counter narrative, right. So if you could I'd like you to kind of summarize what you see as kind of the fundamental security problems in Nigeria for us. And then if you'd like also maybe to add on to or respond to some of the points that Cheta raised.
Thank you, James, and thank you to Hudson too for organizing this. I think it's timely. The conversation is quite rife in Nigeria at the moment. There are discussions around how the expanded relationship between Nigeria and the United States is in a way affecting Nigeria's sovereignty. Several think tanks, very influential researchers have written to suggest that Nigeria's sovereignty has been let go, as it were, handed over to the United States. And that, I think, is so impactful in terms of Nigeria's democratic progress. In this Fourth Republic, which is the longest that Nigeria has seen, I think this is the first time that we're seeing think tanks, respected individuals, academicians, writing and reflecting on that. Cheta did mention the December 25th, 2025 military strikes. This is the first time in Nigeria's post-independence history that a foreign country is carrying out military strikes within Nigeria. For historians who would remember, during Nigeria's civil war, 1967 to 1970, it came at a time when Nigeria had little or no air force assets. And there were offers from partners across the world to support Nigeria in terms of its air capabilities. And that included bringing in aircrafts and pilots. But I think to protect that sovereignty, Nigeria rejected those offers. And what Nigeria did at that time was to buy military jets, aircrafts, and got pilots from Egypt who now flew the aircraft. So in one way or the other, trying to protect the sovereignty. And I think this is very important for the context of the conversation that we're having. With regards to the allegation of Christian genocide, I must say that it wasn't really President Trump that started that allegation. It started from especially clerics and I would say some lobbyists associated with secessionist group within the Southeast. And I think one of the most obvious indicators was when, after the attack in Benue State, when so far an unknown group attacked a part of Benue State and killed several individuals there. The president visited, and then one of the most respected traditional rulers in front of the Nigerian president stood up and said, "No, Mr. President, you are referring to farmer other violence, you are referring to attacks by insurgents. No, this is genocide." And and this respected traditional ruler was an academician. I think has a professorial profile, and said that in front of the president. And it was reported by the media and all of that. So it wasn't really surprising when Trump came up with that, because there was enough evidence to suggest that there was a lot of lobbying by these groups in the United States. And a lot of the conversation is that lobbying kind of aligned with Trump's domestic support base, which is the evangelical support base, and he kind of latched onto it. The administration latched onto it, and where we are. The reality is extremely different. Just like Cheta mentioned, there are several security challenges. What has been described as a polycrisis is what's going on in Nigeria at the moment. Complex, dynamic threat elements that are confronting the state, and the state unfortunately has not come up with measures to address those complex challenges, and I'll quickly kind of go through them. The most common non-state groups, they are armed groups that are challenging the supremacy of the use of force by the state. They are spread across several parts of the country. Some of them are ideological. And I think it's important at this stage to mention that Nigeria has a Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act law, which is domesticated and has recognized 6 of these terrorist groups. And I'll quickly mention them. The Jama'at al-Ahl Sunnah lil Dawati wal Jihad, which otherwise is called JAS, and then the Islamic State in West Africa Province, Ansaru, Lakurawa, and then two others that are enablers. They were introduced by the erstwhile administration of late President Buhari. He called them Mbindiga and then Yembanga, which it's the local in the local northern language Hausa means gunmen and then vigilantes. So that's a bit nebulous. It's not really clear, but they are contained as part of the terrorist groups in Nigeria. And then you have the controversial one, which is the secessionist group called the Indigenous People of Biafra. So all in all, 6 or 7 groups are contained in that document as terrorist groups. And then you also have a list of about 135 names that are recognized. These are names of individuals and companies that are recognized as terror sponsors in that document. There's also a mechanism for continuous identification and recognition of such groups. It's called the sanctions measure. There is a committee headed by the Attorney General of the Federation, the Minister of Justice, who receives petition and then submits it to a competent court of jurisdiction. The president, who has an administrative power to name groups that he sees are terrorists. And recently, he gave a blanket directive that anyone who threatens the peace of Nigeria is also categorized as a terrorist group. So that's one of the most, I would say, active challenges that Nigeria is facing at the moment. But you also have the farmer herder violence, you have banditry, a group of commercially oriented, itinerant gunmen who find havens in ungoverned spaces within Nigeria, mostly in northwestern and north central parts of Nigeria. They attack villages, attack security forces, and at random actually, and carry on their activities. I did mention secessionist group. There are cult groups also spread across most of Nigeria. Then you also have the militant groups that are domiciled mainly in the Niger Delta area, as well as organized criminal gangs that are spread across almost all the entire country. Then you also have what has been described as political talks. They are associated with political, either parties or sometimes individuals, and they also play a role in that regard. One of the most, I would say, silent threat elements that is not often spoken are the ethnic militias. Nigeria has in the minimum about 250 ethnic groups, and almost all of these groups have one way or the other either sponsored or supported the existence of armed militias that are outside the state. So these are some of the active threat elements of Nigeria, and that each of them, at every point in time, operates and affects Nigeria's national internal security.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think it certainly helps us understand that the complexity and the scale of I think the security problems. I want to turn to Yusuf, but actually first I'd like to turn very quickly to Cheta, just to respond to a point that Dr. Kabir made. If you have maybe just in 30 seconds, Dr. Kabir talked about the kind of what he sees as the lobbying push. And I know that you've been following U.S.-Nigeria relations for a while. Do you agree that this is kind of a recent development? And do you agree with kind of the framing of that? Or how do you see the Nigerian side of this activism, this advocacy, if you will, around that genocide claim, related claims?
There has been lobbying, and the lobbying has been going on for a long time, so it's not recent. I think it's important to point out that, for example, IPOB, the Indigenous People of Biafra, as far back as 2018, we're already lobbying the U.S. government. It's only fairly recent that the U.S. government moved, but I mean, my limited knowledge of the way Washington works is that it takes time to move the needle. Which is why I think that the fact that the Nigerian government is responding and expecting quick results, it may not necessarily work. But yes, there has been lobbying. And the result, as it were, is part of what I talked about earlier, that we tend to be reactive, not proactive. Because if we had been looking at this for a long time, we would have actually started working to counter those efforts. Having said that, again, one of the problems that we have is we have a problem of our narrative, our storytelling is designed to make political actors look good. It's not designed to actually present the facts. So you'll find that what the long-term effect of that has been to erode trust. So when certain groups say things in a vacuum and nobody responds, and then begin to respond from a political, ethnic, or religious lens later on, people immediately switch off.
Thank you, Cheta. I think that's a helpful addendum to what Dr. Kabir was saying, particularly about the way in which these narratives kind of get very politicized and ethnicized. I think we've seen that in the social media discourse about blaming different groups for this, that, or the other thing in recent months, particularly around this U.S.-Nigeria stuff. So Yusuf, I'd like to turn to you. Dr. Kabir kind of gave us a very kind of an overview of the different threat elements, the national security issues at a national level. I'd like you to talk a bit about the Northwest, because this is an area that now, after the U.S. airstrikes, the U.S. military has in some ways been, operated there. The Nigerian military is quite active in the region. I can safely say that you're one of the I would say the global experts on the Northwest and the security problems there. I've learned a lot from you over the years. So, a lot of people, I think a lot of observers were surprised not only by the Christmas Day airstrikes, but particularly that the targets selected were in Sokoto State in the Northwest rather than the Northeast, where you have ISWAP and JAS, which are kind of the two biggest jihadist factions. So can you tell us a bit about kind of how you see the security context in Northwestern Nigeria? Who are the different actors and stuff? And what impact, either kind of tactically or more broadly, maybe politically even, do you think the strikes have had?
Okay, thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, everyone. So my understanding of the current situation is that in fact, the Northwest has almost become the very heavy epicenter of violence in Nigeria in recent years. There is also the growth of what I would describe as there seems to be a lot of consistent engagements between bandits and, jihadi elements, either within Nigeria, within the Northeast, within the North Central, Niger, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Mali, in efforts to recruit, or I would say persuade a lot of these bandits into believing the strong ideological leanings of the jihadi groups. As we all know, most of these bandit groups are not ideologically inclined, or they do not base their violence on the basis of ideology, but more economical, criminal, more community nuance than ideology. However, I think what we have seen, especially in the last 7 months in the Northwest, is consistent efforts, especially by jihadi elements, to persuade a lot of bandit groups to adopt these ideologies. It didn't start in the last 7 months, at least it started more than 5 or 6 years ago, sometimes with little successes and also enormous challenges. But I think what we see now is a bit different, in the sense that both the jihadis and also the bandits are almost coming into a kind of alignment that indicates both groups are beginning to see the interest in working together. And it is not only on the basis of ideology, while ideological groups are also seeing the interest in operating in the Northwest of Nigeria, because it seems what it seems is that it seems to allow violence without much of state challenges like what you would see in the Northeast. Basically saying there is more fertile ground for people to perpetrate violence, take people's wealth, and have less challenges as compared to the Northeast and other parts of the country. On the other hand, also, the growth of the Lakurawa group in Sokoto and Kebbi has been increasingly concerning. There is no clarity and there is no clear allegiance. I think this group has shown to be ideological driven, and it does not, in its operation, align entirely with the typical bandits' nature of operations. So I think this upscales the levels of concerns in the Northwest. It's looking at how bandits have almost infiltrated almost every corner of the region. If you take, except for instance, Jigawa, I think a part of Kano, with Katsina, Zamfara, Sokoto, Kaduna, and Kebbi, bandits are almost stationed at almost every corner of this region, and are able to perpetrate violence against government security forces and also the civilian population in a very, I would say, in a way that puts the population and the government in a very difficult position. So I think that it is almost right that the population of this region would celebrate any efforts. Of course, noting that the sovereignty of Nigeria is very important to all of us and to the people. But I think after 10 years of consistent violence, any intervention that seems to degrade these groups is welcome by the people. What is, however, challenging for people to accept is that American intervention, for instance, has not focused on the key actors of the violence. If, for instance, you have to put on the balance between the activities of Lakurawa and bandits, they are not even proportionate. I don't think if you put the level of violence in the Northwest on a measuring scale, I do not think Lakurawa would take 10% of it. So I think that the situation is really very difficult for the people. Government interventions continue, but they are very limited in terms of what is necessary in repelling this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. That's a very helpful overview. So, Michael, I'd like to turn to you now. We've heard from a few different perspectives on kind of you could say maybe the conflicting views within Nigeria. Some people welcoming any action that degrades these militant groups. Others being very concerned about the issues of sovereignty and stuff. I think that one question that hangs over all of this is what is kind of the ultimate end goal for the administration here. It's in terms of the actual kind of statements from the president himself. There've been relatively few of them regarding Nigeria policy, and they've all talked about violence against Christians and how it needs to stop. So is that kind of do we take the president at his word that this is principally driven by concern over the violence that's affecting Christians? Possibly even meaning that in regions where the violence affects Muslims, there's not as much U.S. interest. And if so, what are the kind of metrics that the government is using to judge progress in that effort? Or do you think there are kind of other objectives here, that it's about the broader security situation, or either that there are kind of non-military, non-security dimensions to the administration's policy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think that when we start off trying to interpret what the Trump administration is doing or what President Trump's doing, go back to the earlier point about we have to operate on the facts. And I think one of the things I've been concerned about with the coverage and even expert commentary on this issue is the degree of selective amnesia that sometimes exists. And if you go back to December 2020, we had a number of Africa-related events happen towards the end of the first term of the Trump administration. We had Somalia with the troop drawdown. We had the recognition of sovereignty over Western Sahara. We had the CPC designation on Nigeria. So this is not an emergent set of policies that's happening on Africa by the Trump administration. This is a continuation. And I think that we have to acknowledge that right off the bat. And I think that is not acknowledged often enough. And I think that is extremely problematic with trying to understand what the Trump administration is doing, because there is this expression of shock We just saw this with Rubio's speech in Europe. I have no idea why some people were apparently shocked by what he said. I mean, the State Department came out with an agency strategic plan in January, which literally had an entire pillar, which was effectively what he said in his speech. So I think that, this expression of shock or surprise or whatever you want to say, to me, especially when it comes from experts or comes from media or it comes from politicians, that's extremely problematic for the discourse. And it makes it hard to interpret what the Trump administration is trying to do. So I think, you have to root this stuff in facts. And I think the first thing you have to acknowledge when you're interpreting this as an expert is that none of us can go inside the head of President Trump and say, this is what President Trump is thinking. Like, that's not possible, right? What we can say is, here's the context and here's the decision making and here's what we've witnessed, here's what we've observed over time. And you got to go back, I think, to at least December 2020 to start that conversation in the context of Nigeria. And so when you look at what happened in the aftermath, right, under the Biden administration focused a lot on democracy, right? The Summit for Democracy. I mean, that was probably one of the greatest failures of the Biden administration. Very few people even know what the Summit for Democracy is when you talk about it, who aren't experts on democracy. And this was supposed to be a keystone deliverable of the Biden administration. And so you go back to when they made the decision not to terminate effectively the CPC designation and the reaction that happened. And Nahol Tusi wrote this great piece back in November of 2021. And I'll read the first paragraph because I think it's really important as a starting point when you're trying to answer this question that you asked me. This is how it starts. Christian groups, a U.S. government panel, and former senior U.S. diplomats are furious over Secretary of State Antony Blinken's decision to take Nigeria off a list of countries accused of engaging in or tolerating religious persecution. Now, let's be clear, that's not Christian genocide. That's a separate issue. But this is a contentious political issue that didn't just arise with the CPC designation under the second term of the Trump administration. This has been a smoldering issue. And it was extremely problematic for the Biden administration because if you go back to that first designation, one of the things that happened when Nigeria was designated, it was the first secular democracy ever to be added to the CPC list. And so you have the Biden administration coming in and say, we're going to promote democracy. And you have a democracy that's on this list. So they made the decision to take them off the list. And that was contentious for people who believe they should be on the list. So this is where the political discourse and the opinions come in, right? So you go through the Biden administration. Obviously, there were Christian groups. If you actually go to what was said, the press release that came out from USCIRF, which is an independent bipartisan committee, and we can have a whole discussion about like how independent, how bipartisan. There's a lot of debate about all that, right? But regardless, it was an independent bipartisan. In November of 2021, they came out with a press release in reaction to the Biden administration that said they were appalled. This is an independent bipartisan committee, said they were appalled that the administration had removed Nigeria from the list. So there has been political debate about this and deep political debate about this across two prior administrations that got us to this point. And we get to this point. And so, the Trump administration makes a CPC, and that's really the starting point for a lot of this discourse on, what is Trump trying to do? What's the point? And there's another event that happens with the Christmas event, which was also shocking to people. And people expressed surprise and everything else when that happened. When that happened, if you look at the actual reporting that was coming out from the Catholic World Report, from the International Christian Concern in the weeks leading up to Christmas, they were publishing articles saying that Nigerian Christians are going to face attacks, deadly attacks for their faith. And, that this is coming. And you had the Equipping the Persecuted, reporting coming out saying that they had evidence that this was coming. And so this is all leading up to this decision for the whether it's unilateral or bilateral or who knows what it was, but the military strike, right? So again, yes, I didn't expect the strike. I mean, I'm not that clairvoyant. I was not surprised at all by the CPC designation. I'm actually surprised. I'm far more surprised that India wasn't added as a watch country than that Nigeria was added back to the list. Because I think there's a consistency with the Trump administration. I mean, what they did, I mean, look what they've done with the Polisario front. Look what they've done with Somaliland. Look what they're doing with these things, right? Like, so, I think that there is a continuation from December 2020 that we have to be aware of, and it exists. So I don't think that's surprising. I think in retrospect, it shouldn't have been that surprising that something happened around Christmas, given all the reporting that was coming out. And, these are organizations that members of Congress who are in charge of a lot of this that's happened on Nigeria are closely associated with, or read or use as sources of information. And so that was all coming out, right? So I think that to make sense of all of this, right, I think there's 4 framings that this comes under when we talk about U.S.-Nigeria relations in the context of violence against Christians or just violence in general. You can frame it through the counterterrorism lens, through the regional security lens, which is like the traditional DoD approach, the AFRICOM approach. This is a counterterrorism issue. And, yes, you can frame it as the victims are of a certain religious group, but you're not framing it as Christian violence or Christian genocide. You're framing it as terrorism. And that is one lens that has been the traditional lens that, we've looked at it through. Another lens is the democratic backsliding lens, that this violence, this sectarian violence, is emerging from the fact that democracy is eroding in Nigeria. And that was another lens that it's looked through. I think that the religious persecution lens is its own lens, and that is an important lens. And I don't think this is a new lens. I mean, this lens has been around for a while, and it's been at the highest levels of government for a while. So I think that that's another lens. And then I think there's one lens that no one ever talks about, which is a domestic political lens. And, all of the concerns, about the role that Nigeria plays in U.S. domestic politics, especially the Nigerian diaspora and all of the other things that you hear people express concerns about, that there's a political bias in certain countries when they engage in domestic politics, whether that's Nigerian Americans from the diaspora or whether that's individuals from outside the U.S. who are engaged. There's been concerns that people have expressed around that. So I think you have these 4 framings that happen, and then people latch onto those framings. They latch onto some combination of those framings, and certain special interest groups, certain individuals, they latch onto all of that. And I think bureaucratic politics comes into play. And so when I'm trying to make sense of what the Trump administration is trying to achieve here, what's their strategy? The Trump administration, I don't know what motivated the attack. I mean, I think the CPC is pretty clear. I mean, there's a long history of an independent commission saying that Nigeria deserved to be on the list. I don't think that's surprising, but I think that the attack and then the escalation and then the rhetoric and all of the other stuff that happened, that was a pretty rapid escalation. But the people who were involved in either advising or motivating or pushing, they were latched onto these different sort of framings, whatever the framings are. And there's another framing in the background, the domestic political one, which is the migration one. And you've heard people who are involved in all of this talk about, the risk that this poses to the United States in the long term because of the growing population in the Sahel and in Nigeria and in sub-Saharan Africa, and about how this is going to cause a problem in the long term. So we need to deal with it now. So I think that's a domestic political, that's a migration, homeland security, immigration issue. So I don't think it's simple, is I guess the point of all this. So everyone has these little framings, everyone has their own approaches, and they're all advocating, they're all pushing, they're all, and Congress played a big role in all of this, and escalating all of this and engaging in all of this. And AFRICOM is facing right now a big question about whether or not they will exist. Are they going to get dissolved? So I think all of these things are pushing on the Trump administration. So what is the strategy? I think the strategy is that the President Trump made the statement, he put everything into play, and now the bureaucratic politics is playing out. Now all the different groups are pushing their agenda and trying to maximize what they want to achieve. I don't think there's a unified strategy. I think it's a fragmented approach. And I think you have multiple groups who are advocating for their positions, for their equities, for their goals and objectives. And what we're seeing is because you have so many groups, it doesn't appear coherent.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. That's a very, I think, interesting and kind of helpful overview of maybe the different political factions even at play, if you will, or the different political angles of this in the U.S. You kind of actually answered my second question, which was about the possibility for escalation, or is this on autopilot? I think you made a good point, right? I think the CPC designation probably wasn't a surprise to many people, but obviously we're seeing something new with kind of the military dimension. So thank you very much for those inputs. Cheta, I'd like to turn quickly to you. We're now a year away from Nigerian elections, and I think kind of the unofficial campaign season here in Nigeria has already been in swing for a while, right? So do you see kind of two sides of this, right? Do you see the elections in Nigeria influencing in some ways the Tinubu government's and the Tinubu administration's policies, both kind of on the diplomatic front, with the U.S., but also in terms of, say, their security strategy, with the increased U.S. focus on the country. But then kind of likewise, do you see either, inadvertently or otherwise, that the U.S., the Trump administration's policies will become part of the election, discourse or influence the elections in one way or another?
So I think that the 2027 election cycle will not materially change, regardless of what happens. I think in many respects, the elections, unless there's some sort of black swan event that we haven't seen, I think that the elections have already been sewn up, and President Tinubu's second term is more or less assured. One thing that's one of my colleagues said before the 2023 elections, and which has proven very, very prescient, is Tinubu is not a governance animal. He's a political animal. So it's not surprising as a result of that when you see that effectively campaign started in 2025. 2 full years before the election. We've been in campaign season for a long time, and he's successfully moved the needle in terms of a lot of Nigeria's political elites to his side of the ledger. We are effectively a one-party state. So again, unless something fundamentally changes, that the local politics is sewn up. Even if, in many respects, local politics is divorced from what the streets are saying. The real dilemma is that is for governors who are more at risk in that respect. So there's already pressure coming from the fact that a lot of people do not like the that's impingement on Nigeria's sovereignty, that narrative. But there's also pressure coming from the Christian genocide narrative, which has deepened polarization online. What's one thing that is very clear is that people now profile. It's now baked in. People profile you based on what part of the country you are from, and they don't once they've come to the decision that, oh, because you're from this part of the country, this is the position you will adopt. There's nothing that you will say that they will be looking at it from that lens. I think that if anything, the bigger thing that may be a banana skin for Tinubu is the fact that visa restrictions, which initially were linked to the CPC designation, but are now part of a wider move by the Trump administration to reduce the movement of people from our part of the world towards the United States. Those visa restrictions are already having an effect. Even well-to-do Nigerians are unable to get US visas. Families who are dependent on remittances are beginning to see that slow down, especially when you consider that I think it was a member of Congress, I don't remember who exactly, said something regarding remittances. So remittances, it's important to point out, are a larger contributor to Nigeria nowadays than oil. So that's something that is very, very important. If members of Nigeria's elites, whether it's political or business elites, look at all the concessions that the Tinubu government has made to the Trump government, and those visa restrictions are still not restricted, there may be that popular anger that would work against Tinubu. For me, from my point of view, that's the key thing. That's the key risk for him. But it's also important to point out that the pressure from the United States has empowered domestic actors who frame insecurity as religious persecution, because this could potentially mobilize Christian voters and in one direction and alienate Northern Muslim voters in the opposite direction. So that would only deepen Nigeria's existing polarization. So, for example, MURIC, the Muslim rights concern, has documented Muslim deaths from terrorism and keep making the point that these Muslim deaths, are not a part of the international discussion. The manner in which MURIC makes those points only helps to deepen polarization. But when you see the kind of rhetoric coming from various parts of the US establishments, various parts of southern Nigerian establishments, and then organizations such as MURIC, for me, the key thing is not whether Tinubu will come back into office, but what kind of country he will preside over in his second term and what he would potentially hand over to a potential prospective successor in 2031. I think ultimately the deeper dynamic is that Trump's policies will not have an influence on the outcome of the election. I think the real issue is the responses they will provoke and what the outcome will be. A government that, and then we must put this in context with what is happening in the broader Sahel. Like it or not, the West is not very popular in the broader Sahel, and northern Nigeria is geographically contiguous with countries like Niger, where definitely the West, especially the French, but Washington is seen as being on the French side of the ledger in that so northern Nigeria tends to think in those directions as well, given that there's clearly a backlash against the West in the Sahel, which includes northern Nigeria. Remember that during the last year, was it no, I mix it up. In 2024, yes, during the protest about economic conditions, Russian flags showed up. So I personally do not think that I don't see the Russians as bad actors. I don't see the Chinese as bad actors. I don't see the Americans as bad actors. Everybody's pursuing their interests. The question is whose interests is more aligned to our interests right now. But then that leads to another question. What is Nigeria's interest? So the ultimate test really is whether Tinubu can convert diplomatic gains into visible security dividends for Nigerians, because that's what will determine the kind of country he will leave behind. But in my view, again, unless some black swan events happens, Tinubu is locked in for a second term.
Cheta, so thank you for sharing that perspective there, and I'm glad you brought in the focus on kind of what matters for ordinary Nigerians, right? Stuff like the visa ban, which has had a significant impact already, and then the question of security dividends for ordinary Nigerians, as opposed to just kind of the elite diplomatic angle to all of this. So, Dr. Kabir, I'd like if you could talk a bit about that security angle, and particularly whether you see, now that there are going to be, it seems like up to 200 U.S. troops working with the Nigerian military. Publicly, the Nigerian government and military has kind of welcomed this assistance and said that it can actually, it can help with some of the intelligence sharing, some of the tactical kind of dimensions of the military operations. Do you see this as, the next year as an opportunity to kind of show for the Tinubu government to show that it's kind of utilizing that American security assistance effectively? Are you optimistic that this will have kind of a real security dividends, or do you see, do you think that the risks outweigh the possible benefits in that regard?
Thank you, James. Absolutely, I see a potential for enhancing Nigeria's both defense and security capabilities. No doubt the United States prowess, as it were, in its military escapades is well documented. I mean, with the recent developments in Venezuela, in Iran at the moment, and several other parts of the world. But so embedded in that as well is some unfortunate outcomes of American military intervention in countries like Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. And Nigerians, unfortunately, are quite aware. And so that apprehension is being expressed today. But I also want to mention that, yes, the framing, the partnership is put across as a security partnership. But just like previous speakers, and I think Cheta in particular has highlighted, that there are several dimensions to this development, some political, others social. The polarization that we're talking about could, in a very, very direct way, affect Nigeria's democracy. The tectonic templates that Nigeria lies upon are ethnicity and religion. And to an extent, this particular issue, the way it's being framed, is affecting that tectonic template. And if it's not managed effectively, no matter what positive outcome the security partnership would bring, it would create new challenges that would make those outcomes useless. So I think it's very important. And it's also very, very important that players within the US, especially the Trump administration, take that into consideration. Nigeria is a very proud country, and I think in my earlier remark, I tried to remind us of that, of the fact that even at the time of absolute need, Nigeria tried to maintain its sovereignty. Now, this is not in any way belittling the challenges that Nigeria has. Those challenges are real, and I know at some point, Cheta did mention that the Nigerian government is unable to manage its internal security. I don't agree with that, for the simple reason that to a great extent, law and order is maintained in Nigeria. Yeah, there are instances of huge security challenges. They were reminded every day of that. But I think to say it's completely broken down would be taking it to another level. So having said all of that, yes, the military partnership can support Nigeria's quest for enhanced both in terms of production, acquisition of military hardware, as well as other security hardware, intelligence sharing, strategy, and all of that. And I think there are examples that would test whether this would be a reality. Just 2 days ago, there was an attack in Borno State in northeast Nigeria, where armed groups, most likely affiliated with the Islamic State in West Africa province group, attacked a military formation and ended up killing about 8 military men. Now, they traveled a distance of almost about 30 kilometers on motorbikes, about 50 of them, between 50 and 70 of them. Now, questions are already imagined that with this partnership between Nigeria and the US, how come that was not stalled in terms of first intelligence, identifying the threat element, and then making sure the threat element does not attack that target? And then secondly, even if the attack happens, what kind of support would be provided by the American forces to identify where they came from, where they are at the moment, and then of course, some form of military action to take it. So all of this would play into the other consequences that we've highlighted. And I think it's absolutely important for the Trump administration to realize. I mean, reading through the US National Security Strategy 2026 that was released in 2025, it's very clear that the American interest in Africa and probably in Nigeria has nothing to do with democracy, at least if we go by that national security strategy. But even if the interest is tilted towards other objectives like stated in that document, those can only happen if Nigeria's government is stable, as it were. And I think so it's very important that as we progress in this, that the US administration realizes the consequences of this, some of this action, and that a whole of government kind of approach is considered. There can't be a joint working group discussing and negotiating with the Nigerian government, and then you now have congressmen going to submit, bills, as it were, that is going against the objectives of the joint working group. What that does is it kind of triggers some of the other risk elements that we've identified as part of this conversation. It also enhances that polarization. And so while dealing with that challenge, new challenges will emerge, and whatever benefit of that. In closing, I must say that one of the objectives, imperatives of this current administration, the Tinubu administration, is to enhance defense equipment production by 40% when it hands over, whatever, after the elections in 2027. And so that's a clear pathway for this cooperation to be tested. I know using Nigeria's strategic autonomy, where it's already discussing with other partners, Turkey is one of them. It's also discussing with some other African countries, but none of this have the potential, I think, to enhance that capacity like what it has with the United States. So there are good examples to actually measure and understand how this partnership would go down the road, 12 months, 1 year down the road.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kabir, for making those points. I think it's important, as you highlight, right? I think is trying to identify the areas for potentially positive impact while being well aware of the risks that the new, this new kind of course that we're on might entail. So I'd just like to quickly give everyone a chance to give kind of a final 1-minute comment. Maybe Michael, starting with you, I appreciated your points earlier about the different elements of U.S. policy and how they're maybe not fully aligned. Could you give us maybe just some final thoughts about where you maybe see things headed over the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think there's a wide range of possible worlds that could arise in 12 months. And the world that I don't want to see arise, and I don't think anybody should want to see arise, except for maybe our major power adversaries, is what happened to France in Niger, where it basically came down to a narrative around neo-colonial plots to stay in power, right? Like that would be a very bad outcome for the United States. It'd be a very bad outcome for Nigeria. But I think that where we're at right now with the military intervention, we're talking about security force assistance. We're talking about potentially asymmetric warfare. And we're likely talking about private military contractors as something on the table. And so, those three things, that combination of things creates conditions for, a lot of that neo-colonial discourse bubbling up. And it gives actors the ability to make those arguments. And I think that's something that the administration is going to have to counter. And I think one of the ways they're going to try to counter that is through the commerce and investment partnership. It's through, having success on the battlefield. It's through a lot of other things and being able to show progress. And so, I would say that there's so many different possible outcomes that it's very hard to say where we're going to be in 12 months. Because there's too many variables to do that. But the outcome that I don't want to see happen is that neo-colonial plot outcome that happened to France.
Thank you, Michael. Cheta, how about over to you? I noticed the other day, actually, while kind of scrolling through Twitter, I somehow made it onto your profile. I'm going to call you out here slightly. And I saw you had a tweet from, I think, October 2024 about kind of maybe the emerging multipolar world and the fact that the so-called rules-based international order was something that you personally were going to miss when it's gone. And you made that perhaps provocative comment earlier that you just see countries pursuing their interests in West Africa.
All of us will miss it when it's gone.
All of us. So please, thank you for correcting me. And can you speak a bit about that in context of the other comments you've made so far and how that relates to this U.S. Nigeria?
Yeah, so for 80 years we've had a somewhat stable and predictable world, which was guaranteed by the U.S. Unfortunately, it's the U.S. itself that is doing a lot of things to trash that order. Think of, for example, Marco Rubio's speech at Munich last week. That's for those of us from the global south, listening to that was a horror show. And unfortunately, that is the direction of travel. When you read the national security strategy and all of that, the entire continent of Africa, my continent, occupied less than a paragraph in the entire, in what, 29 pages of documents. That tells us, as Dr. Kabir has pointed out, it's clearly about interests now. It's no longer about, quote and unquote, what is right for everyone. We are now headed into a world of serious competition, and as Mike has pointed out, the outcome will not be good for the US. The outcome will not be good for Nigeria. I think the outcome will not be good for anyone. Are we irrevocably on that path? I don't know. In my opinion, I think that the midterms in the US in a few months will tell. But if we stay on that path, then we will squarely return back to a world of might is right. And the reason why I say I'm afraid of such a world is that my part of the world, Dr. Kabir and Yusuf's part of the world, were at the bottom of the food chain. So we will be on the menu.
Thank you, Cheta. Dr. Kabir, any final comments?
Yes, I think just to build on what Cheta said, we are on the menu, and I think this is something that the Nigerian government should perhaps appreciate and build upon. Having said that, I think it's absolutely important that as we continue along this path, there's a joint working group between the two sides. And I believe that joint working group should be given a chance. What's the point of setting up something where very senior officials are represented and then it's not being given the chance? And what do I mean by that? When statements and actions are taken that are in clear contradiction of the spirit and the purpose for which that joint working group was set up, all it does is just add more problems to what already exists. If the essence is to support end the killings of Nigerians, and hopefully not just Christians, but all Nigerians, then I believe that that joint working group should be given a chance. And for me, as someone with the long years of experience in Nigeria's security sector and who understands both the institutional and structural challenges, what is required is a security sector reform that looks principally at security sector governance and then enhances accountability. And the US has the influence to actually demand for that from the Nigerian government. So I'm hoping to see, as we progress, some form of redirection of the United States objectives, irrespective of whatever led to where we are at the moment, to emphasize points around security sector governance and accountability on the side of the government, and not necessarily in the manner that it's going at the moment. It would not address the root causes of the security challenge. Only good governance with strong accountability elements would help address those root causes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all my panelists. I think that's a good, we've gotten a good kind of range of views shared here, identified some potential opportunities, some areas where maybe things are a bit more hopeful, but also a lot of areas of risk, areas of skepticism in terms of how this kind of new policy and the new relationship, if you will, is viewed in different quarters. All I can say is that I hope that if we reconvene this panel in a year, as Dr. Kabir was saying at the end, that we'll have some good news to discuss in terms of the status of insecurity in the country, improvements in the lives of ordinary Nigerians. I think that's ultimately the most important question here. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for tuning in.